BBC's ideological echo chamber. I took interest in BBC's new ideological direction when some radio hosts claimed they were fired because they were males. Of course, there was no way to factually prove they were telling the truth, but with the BBC being recently open about indeed firing men, I wanted to contribute to challenge BBC's ideological echo chamber. While I was developing this document, someone named James Damore dared to challenge Google's echo chamber and he was sacked promptly, and I suspect another political firing could happen to me. For that reason, you'll understand I'm not signing this document with my real name. Unlike Damore, I do not have data about BBC's workers' political and ideological inclinations, and so I cannot prove the BBC is immersed in an ideological echo chamber. However, the recent policies, the treatment of social issues in BBC Three involving men, and BBC's horrible new YouTube channel makes me think that BBC might indeed be developing an overprotective, authoritative left identity, like many journalism and media outlets that are not openly right-wing seem to be becoming. We used to be told that feminism and gender equality was not a zero-sum game, and that the acquisition of rights for women would not diminish the rights or status men already enjoyed. Yet here we are, seeing men being fired, or as BBC puts it, not renewed, to make women take their roles. Many people would consider this to be a needed sacrifice in order to achieve greater good. This is an interesting topic that would need a broad conversation about rights, values, and philosophy. For the moment, I feel we are not doing everything we can for women and diversity workforce without wrongdoing other demographics, so I won't be dwelling in the greater good point. Some perspective. Women show a greater inclination to look for work-life balance, and not only because of motherhood and the conformity of social expectations that come with it, as many people believe. Single mothers with no obligations also favor career choices that allow them to have the desired work-life balance. We can find consistent evidence of that in several studies, but the oldest one I could find dates from the beginning of the 80s, which implies we've been ignoring the reality of women's desires and aspirations for more than 30 years. We fail to acknowledge that women are fully functioning adults that actively take conscious choices, like trading off money in exchange for life balance. On the other hand, men earn more money at the trade-off of work-life balance. According to Warren Farrell, who has extensively written about the topic, men earn more than women, but not for the same work. For 25 different workplace choices, men's choices lead to men earning more money, women's choices lead women having better lives. Men's trade-offs include working more hours, women typically work more at home, taking more hazardous assignments, cab driving, construction, trucking. Moving overseas or to an undesirable location on demand, women's greater family obligations inhibit this, and training for more technical jobs with less people contact, e.g. engineering. Women's choices appear more likely to involve a balance between work and the rest of life. Women are more likely to balance income with a desire for safety, fulfillment, potential for personal growth, flexibility, and proximity to home. These lifestyle advantages lead to more people competing for these jobs and thus lower pay. Only when Dr. Farrell's research journey uncovered these 25 differences did the Holy Grail become visible. Women now earn more money for the same work. That is, women earn more when they work equal hours at the same job with the same size of responsibility for the same length of time, with equal productivity, etc. The women's movement can celebrate its greatest single triumph, exceeding its goal of equal pay for equal work. In 2016, Claudia Goldin, a Harvard economist, deeply analyzed the wage gap and concluded that even within the same occupation, women make less than men because they work differently, in line with their interests, and take choices that lead to a higher flexibility and the monetary trade-off that comes with it. According to the figures 21 and 22 of this Office for National Statistics report, women have been working the same number of hours for a decade, while men started on a higher number and have steadily been decreasing, mainly cutting their overtime, which was and still is superior to women's. On top of all this, diverse occupational choices for the aggregate of men and the aggregate of women keep diverting the more prosperous the country is, to the point that countries who score the highest inequality show a fallback to traditional, more sexually segregated jobs. This is known as the gender equality paradox, a phenomenon particularly strong in countries like Sweden and Norway. This means that, in places where the first concern of women is survival, women take similar career choices to men, who naturally tend to go for these more money, less life jobs. But when the threshold of survival has been surpassed, women start shifting their career choices to fit their ambitions, which differ to men's. It could be counter-argued that these ambitions women show are the result of social conditioning, but then there's two things to consider. 1. Let's get real. It's unlikely that women in countries like Sweden and Norway are more conditioned than the ones in Rwanda and India, where their job choices are more similar to men's. 2. A study in 2010 with a sample of 200,000 people over 53 countries showed this. Surprisingly, men and women career ambitions are incredibly consistent regardless of country and culture. The countries that better reflect these ambitions are the likes of Sweden and Norway. Now you may be wondering, if Sweden and Norway have women's career paths differing from men's so much, and if women naturally go for less remunerated jobs, why are they some of the countries with the smallest gender wage gaps? The easiest interpretation is that their smaller gender wage gap naturally derives from the fact that these countries have some of the smallest wage gaps overall, with high taxes on the rich and decent median and de facto minimum wages. Sweden's de facto minimum wage is around 60-70% wage, and a McDonald's worker in Norway earns a minimum of $16 an hour. So in order to close the gender wage gap, the UK should close its massive general wage gap by taking egalitarian policies like taxing the rich or empowering unions. Fun fact, gay people show career tendencies more similar to the opposite gender. Following the train of thought we had until now, it's easy to conclude that would naturally reflect on their income. Indeed, British gay women earn more than the heterosexual ones. Gay men earn less than the heterosexual ones. Yet, the journalists keep scratching their heads or keep ranting about social expectations. All in all, let's sum it all up with a few conclusions. 1. The wage gap is mostly the result of average of men and the average of women taking different career choices. Gender income gap may be a much more appropriate choice of terms. 2. The social expectations argument is not the only possible one to explain the gender income gap. 3. Motherhood plays some role into it, but those gender differences also occur in never married men and never married women samples. 4. Men are working more hours than women. I fail to see how that is to their advantage, since they have been working far more overtime, which is not exactly my definition of fun. They have been steadily cutting that overtime, while women's mean hours have remained the same. It almost looks as if men hate overtime. Weird. 5. If women were indeed paid less than men for exactly the same work, who on earth would be hiring men? All companies would rush to get a competitive advantage by hiring women in bulk. All unemployed people would eventually be men. 6. Women seem to have way more common sense than their self-appointed guardians and advocates give them credit for. 7. Measuring people's performance by the metric of money alone is narrow, outdated, and conservative. 8. If people's performance was to be measured by many other metrics, we would realize women are doing splendidly. In fact, they are doing better than men in the 25 metrics Warren Farrell analyzes. Some of them are fewer late evenings, shorter commutes, more free weekends, more holidays, less overtime, more safety, etc. 9. Most people don't know jack about this issue, and it's simpler to pander to the populace than to educate them, which might explain why the facts I offered previously are not popular and usually end up in social chastising. Politicians can easily get extra voter sympathy advantage on this. 10. For a few decades now, politicians and other social engineers have been advancing the agenda of convincing everyone that people are complete blank slates with no natural differences whatsoever, which is simply untrue. 11. Supposing we want to close the gender wage gap, which is not a bad thing per se, we either A. Sink the economy to the point women will have no other choice but to sacrifice life balance in exchange for higher pay to ensure basic survival. B. Egalize the economy to the point the minimum wage workers and the hyper-rich are not that far apart. C. Start firing those pesky men who keep sacrificing life balance for money. How dare they? D. Start building a totalitarian regime that forces large groups of people to take specific career paths in order to meet whatever criteria we deem fit by whim. E. Pretend we solved the problem. Since the gender wage gap is mostly an issue created by misinterpreting numbers and the general population has a weak grasp on the topic and statistics, we can easily twist those numbers again to meet whatever point we need in our agenda, extra virtue signaling rights and self-appointed righteousness for whoever does this first. Particularly profitable for political parties and corporations that depend on public perception, like the BBC. F. Consider this may not be an issue at all, since wages should reflect to a point the career choices people make. G. Consider this is an issue to a degree, and better yet, consider this an opportunity to try making the job market a friendlier place to people who look for a balanced life or don't have an obsessive or psychopathic approach to work, regardless of their gender, race, or football team. Mediocre life. Personally, I think proposals B and G are the way to go, but you do you. Now the question is the BBC, or generally media, an apt place for people who work for work-life balance? Hell no. I haven't bothered to rack up studies for this one, so I will eyeball based on my experience, and I'm sure most of you will find it relatable in one way or another. Media is not a 9-to-5 job. It's easily 50 or 55-hour weeks that magically turn into 60-hour weeks. It's one of the most competitive fields. The wages are plummeting. Specialist positions are being dropped in favor of demanding jack-of-all-trades that do a bit of everything for a lower pay that they would get committing to either specific task. Naturally, being jacks-of-all-trades means they are masters of none. The quality of the work such workers are involved in has dropped heavily, with the lowest standards of video and audio production we've seen in years. All that shoddy work gets then transferred to post-production houses, which used to be the best shot you could have at a work-life balance in media. The best shot you could get was doing a 9-to-6 in a post-production studio, but even that is dying away. With increasingly quicker turnarounds and increasingly worse production work, video and sound editors have to work their magic at inhuman speeds, and I guess extra hours have gone up. But more importantly, work-life balance is dying because post houses in London are spiraling down the rat race, and all of them are reconverting from 9-to-6 workplaces to 24/7 shift-based ones, where workers will have to work either day or night depending on the week. To keep competitive. It's a matter of time before this will happen elsewhere. The wonders of the free market. Now going back a bit, we concluded that women have the common sense to look for work-life balance more often than men. Well, it's pretty obvious then that moving from a 9-to-6 to a 24/7 rota-based jobs will make less women show interest in these positions. But don't worry ladies, cause the BBC got your bags. Or so they say. The BBC is also moving in these new directions, perhaps a bit slower than the private sector, but still. If I remember correctly, ongoing post-production positions at BBC Bristol are going to be turned into freelancing positions. It saves BBC money and it makes their workers' lives a tad more unstable and unbalanced. If my information is correct, the BBC is going from their current model to their freelancer-based BBC Studios, which theoretically allows for more flexibility and savings. For the BBC, that is, not for its workers. When I started working with the BBC, everyone I worked with took shorter lunch breaks and clocked extra hours in the evening. I was in a low-budget daytime television program. Perhaps that explains why there were barely no specialists in my office, and everyone was labeled a producer, which meant they were responsible for doing all sorts of stuff for a fraction of the price. And that was during the office days. The actual shooting days meant 12-ish hour days with physical work, then loading the van to drive a couple of hours more to the next location. Since I was in a work experience scheme and wasn't paid, more on that later, I couldn't know how much they were paid for that. One of my colleagues humored me. Apparently, they went with salaries, meaning a flat fee no matter the hours. I think the amount was $1,600 for a head of department or something like that. Not bad, you may think, if it was a 40-hour job, but it's not. If you divide that quantity by the hours of work and commute, that would easily be close to national minimum wage. You'd be doing much better working in hospitality or cleaning in any of these companies. When I worked for Cardiff's council, I was paid the real living wage, not the recent Tory crap, was not required to do extra hours and was treated beautifully for a no-skill job. And that was a public body from Wales, an economically humble nation. Why another public body like the BBC treats their employees worse? Don't work in telly. Why did these BBC employees I worked with put up with that, you wonder? Personally, I think they were all lying to themselves. All of them had a motto that was said to me several times: don't work in telly. At first it seemed like a funny catchphrase to justify the incommodities of the job, but I could soon read between the lines and realized there was much more going on. I inquired about it and why they wouldn't leave if they disliked it that much. Here is an anecdote that reflected this whole situation. Well, the conditions of this job are terrible, but on what other job would you meet these many picturesque people, have all these adventures, this variety? Also, you get to travel. Yesterday we were in something or other shite, and today we're in Swansea. I was going to comment that traveling was more than staying 12 hours intensely working in a given place and living the moment you finished by your own means, but I didn't have to utter a word. On the other hand, why would you come to Swansea? It was almost comical and depressing. Don't take me wrong, I left my country behind and ventured into London. I've not, for survival, met the most interesting people I've ever met, been in different locations, did lots of personal growing, learned from another culture, improved language, and it's all been thrilling. But I was in my fucking 20s. I can find a single reason I'd go through all that in my 30s, let alone for a terrible daylight television program meant for all hacks and daft breeds to feel better about themselves without truly accomplishing anything. A program that my colleagues mysteriously happen to like. Now I want a place to call home, a wife, perhaps children, or garden with a fence, a job that is not hysterical and requires me to convince myself I love it. I want to have a life. And so does everyone eventually. And so did my colleagues, I think. They just kept bullshitting themselves. They were not the only ones. I had a gathering with my union and saw the same depressing spectacle. People in their 30s lamenting their lives couldn't allow for children or wedlock, and immediately after convincing each other it was fine because that was the life they had chosen when they went for media studies. And after all these years, I'm so damn sure that's the general state of the industry. In many fields, there is a generational hole between the 20-somethings who will slip under a bridge to see their dreams come true and the 40-somethings that recommend the newcomers not to join the current industry anymore, with the 30-somethings realizing there's more to life than work. Actually, most of my friends reaching 30 are leaving the industry. We moved from a culture of overstressed, overpaid, unhappy yuppies to a culture of overstressed, underpaid, unhappy snowflakes. I bet many women can see that as well. What could really make a difference? Do you want to be a woman-friendly place, BBC? Then be a human-friendly place. Encourage part-time and 9-to-5 shifts. Promote work and life balance. Flexibility for the workers, not just for the employer. Meet the living wage, the real one, not the tourist crap. Offer part-time senior positions. Lobby for more egalitarian economic and social policies across the board, not for a specific demographic that ticks a specific box. There is no need why a public company would need to raise the rat race. Consider alternatives. Your workers should be treated like council workers, not like hyper-stressed media psychopaths. You shouldn't compete for low-budget telly, clickbait and share. You should be doing shallow quality stuff or something that can dethrone Game of Thrones. And a crazy idea that will send the right into a commie-hunting frenzy. Limit the wages of the highest earning stars. Boom, problem solved. In fact, the BBC should cease to talk about women at the workplace as a glance at post-capitalism. After Western societies have raised enough resources during capitalism, it's now the time to think how we share these resources, how we cut back on their abuse, how we stop the rat race, and how we start working just the necessary and start enjoying other things in life. Women seem to have a natural advantage in this new paradigm, so go explore it with them. Also recognize women themselves, with their strengths and their weaknesses. Over the last few years in Western countries, we constructed, deconstructed and reconstructed womanhood so much it's become a Frankenstein's monster. Because they are equal to men and at the same time they are diverse from men, modern women are supposed to be as collaborative as women and as competitive as men, be as social as women and as independent as men, be as empathetic as women and as detached as men, be as sensitive as women and as impervious as men, be as considerate of others as women and as self-assertive as men. Women are now Schrodinger's cats in nature where they have to be two opposites at once, always the strengths of each gender, never the weaknesses. Compared to this, unrealistic body standards seem small fry, and this construct may be affecting their happiness. They are unhappier than they were before. Offer them a more sensible approach. Bear with me for a second. I started doing film and media projects at 16 in Spain, way before finishing my education, so I could gain a competitive advantage over my promotion. And yes, I was a career psychopath at that young age. Dozens of projects, all of them unpaid. I invested into gear and equipment because I thought building experience, contacts and gear was a way to get a job in this market. That meant having a main job during the week and getting into 12-hour days or longer on the weekends. But with low wages, a historical record of unemployment rate bigger than the Great Depressions, and a crisis in media, Spain was no grounds for someone ambitious and as psychopathically goal-oriented as me. I moved to London, only to find higher misery in the lowest class, the recent immigrants. I started making $400 a month, which equal living in cockroach, bedbug and rat-infested houses, sharing bathrooms with no cold water, kitchens with no functioning stoves, and overbooked fridges with 7 more people. Surviving on cheap rice, pasta and potatoes. In the first 12 months, I moved 8 times, trying to find the perfect balance between a cheap rent, third world conditions and abusive landlords. Most migrants I knew confessed hopping often and dropping many kilos, and we literally kept each other fed when one of us was having it rough. That pressure brought us all down often. Women often cried, and men often went berserk. Just a few examples of our day-to-day struggles. Rushing to A&E because my diet was so bad I wasn't able to go to the toilet. They gave me laxatives and told me to change my diet. I realized it was cheaper to buy laxatives than to have a healthy diet, so I stuck to rice, pasta, potatoes, and laxatives for a while. Having to disguise the entire house on a short notice, so it looked like only 4 of us, as opposed to 8, lived there when the council officials came to check. Throwing my precious rice away because the rats got to the kitchen. We would hear them scratching on the walls of our room at night to break in for the next few days. Skipping work due to an allergic reaction to the many bedbug bites we accumulated over a few days. You haven't lived until you have grabbed bedbug nests with your fist. On another horrifying occasion, one of my housemates confessed his rota manager was sexually harassing all the girls of the staff and getting away with it because if they didn't humor him, he would cut their hours. That was in the McDonald's by King's Cross, under the nose of millions of Londoners. Fun times. All this because the job migrants pay the bills with are based on 0-hour contracts and abusive managers, and they don't dare to do anything. With the pitiful money we earn, we are confined to live under abusive zero-ethics landlords that harvest our £0 savings dry while we enjoy a zero-rights tenure formally undisputed under a major zero-fucks-given policy by former Mayor Tory hero Boris. Yeah, hopefully the new mayor is doing a bit better. Most migrants either give up and go back or manage to escape this hell through extraordinary effort. But not for me, for I was a man that pursued a career in media, and so I needed to keep my schedule flexible for the eventual unpaid or poorly paid media projects that middle-high class entitled Brit brats with parents with deep pockets announce in Mandy and Film and TV Pro, and so my efforts had to double everybody else's. Janitor, cleaning, surveillance, waiting, jobs that were offered through part-time agencies at national minimum wage, except the occasional night shifts at McDonald's who came in with an extra. Goodbye work-life balance, hola 0-hour contracts and zero money projects for exposure. And I thought it was worth it. I so did. Is it any wonder many people, migrants or otherwise, give up at some point rather than keep on pushing themselves through all this hell? But here's when things get interesting. At some point in my exhilarating tale of success in the British welfare, I applied for a job for a movie being shot in Greece. The project was unpaid, but I managed to convince the director to pay me $400. Since at that point my rent was $325 for a room share. He was so impressed with my reel he promptly agreed. At some point in the following weeks, either he or the producer changed their mind and went with somebody else for no pay. On a similar occasion, I managed to get into a project and agreed to be paid again, but weeks after the application's deadline closed, they bumped into a sound engineer in a social gathering who not only offered to record on location for free, but also do a 5.1 sound mix in his studio, all for free. How on earth would I ever compete with that? The discrimination no one is talking about. It was at this point that something obvious was presented to me, an industry where in order to set a food you need to work for free. Those with deep pockets, or with parents with deep pockets, would have an unrivaled advantage. I couldn't land a proper career opportunity not because I was from abroad. In fact, all British people I met in the field have treated me beautifully, and they were ready to pay up more monies when I explained I was in a position different to theirs, that is, with no parental support and having to pay rent of my own. I couldn't land a proper career opportunity simply because I could not economically afford it. And it's not only recent immigrants who face this, it's all the British lower class. Years later, a Welsh colleague told me that during her studies, she got a position in a prestigious economic school in London for being the best student of the class, but she couldn't afford London's price for living, so had to refuse. Then the position was offered to the second best in class who had wealthier parents who could afford it. Obviously, he got the position. It's obvious. And I missed it. It's so obvious, and we are all missing it. It's so obvious, so in your face and so self-evident that only someone as psychopathic as people in media, as sophisticated as the British, as hypocritical as the current self-virtue signaling upper middle class, as up their arse as current left-leaning journalists, as disconnected from reality as the star system, would fail to notice. They all band together to create the largest ideological echo chamber to date that ignores the problems of the lower class. Is it any wonder right-wing parties keep winning? Yet here I am, arguing water is wet in the face of people wondering why there is no lower class in media, or why there's no dark-skinned people either. Hint, they're overrepresented in the lower class and underrepresented in the upper high, you geniuses. That sweet, sweet spot. But then I got good news by some people I was doing a low-paid project with. Apparently, the BBC openly did positive discrimination, and I would have it easy to get accepted into their schemes. Soon later, back to my union convinced me to stop working for free and try other routes, like applying for all schemes I could find on Earth. I don't believe in positive discrimination, and my pride and self-respect was what kept me standing through all this hell, so the idea that I got my chance because my butt was first lap in some other country was insulting. Alas, if feeling insulted and having my pride hurt was what it took to get a job in the field, I'd do it. And trust me, I was tempted to buy into the whole self-victimization and blaming my failure in racism against my persona. It would protect my ego, justify my failures, and give a scapegoat to my frustration. I didn't even have to do the rationalization. A whole social narrative growing in popularity would give me the script. Thankfully, I had the common sense to see the reality in my face when it was presented to me. And the truth is that I never had a problem for being a Spaniard. And so I proceeded to apply to different schemes. It turns out that the problems of working for free were far from over, since many companies and bodies, yes, including the BBC, provided everyone, and particularly minorities, with work experiences lasting up to 1 month. Mostly unpaid, which completely defeats the purpose. I already had problems keeping afloat working unpaid weekends, so work experiences were off the table. Then my back-to advisors recommended me to apply to other schemes that could help migrants, like BAME. BAME refused, since I couldn't be victimized based on visual discrimination or something like that, which is a British way of saying, "you're bloody white, mate." Or perhaps a way in which people who are not morally convinced of what they are doing express themselves by not being direct. So according to BAME, and from what I gather, the general consensus of the industry, all white people look exactly the same and no one can tell a Brit from a Spaniard or a Russian. Funny. When the vote for Brexit happened, a disproportionate number of racist aggressions happened to Polish people, but no positive discrimination for them, those pesky whites. Then I realized paid schemes did exist, mainly for people who didn't reach a certain level of studies. Unfortunately, I had completed several superior studies in Spain, so that disqualified me. I was in a sweet, sweet spot. 2 migrant, 2 on my own, 2 without friends, 2 without family, 2 without formal education in the UK, 2 poor to do well in the market in the good old regular ways. On the other hand, 2 white, 2 male, 2 heterosexual, 2 educated to apply to any backup schemes meant for people who had it difficult on the official market race. I'm not the only one to fall in this sweet, sweet spot. The stats of low-class white men in the USA are dropping quickly, since they all have the disadvantages of being low-class and none of the backup plans for being minorities. On top of that, they get all the societal blame from all the delusional people who think that all problems in this world come from white men. But it's okay. I had to leave London and move to Wales in order to afford working in media and putting food on the table, so in the end I could afford the 2 weeks work experience the BBC awarded me with, casually, precisely when I started mentioning I was a migrant in my applications. Although being fair, I have to say that my work applications have become pure poetry after all these years of writing them in the dozens. I guess I will never know. In my wake I saw the sweet, sweet spots. Since career outcomes somewhat depend on the economical background of each individual, schemes that target minorities but fail to pay them are missing the point entirely. A black person from the lower class needs much more help than a black person from an upper middle class, but such schemes will only help the latter. So if you're a racial minority with a comfy money cushion, you're in a sweet, sweet spot, as we've known since the beginning of the 80s, but still fail to acknowledge in the mainstream. I tried arguing about it in Back to a Union, but some people sustain economic and class status played no part in career success. Yep, that I was told, in a bloody union. It was precisely in Back to where I met the most alarming of the sweet, sweet spots. In the annual countrywide gathering, I met 2 spoiled brats and 1 man-hating dyke that argued I would have it easy in the industry since I was a man, that I would have many opportunities, and that it would make sense for me to be discriminated against. If anything, in return of all injustices women had to suffer. I wondered what injustices women had to suffer in Britain, for which a man coming from a humble country with 20% of unemployment and trying to break in the media market for 11 years while living in hell would need to ask forgiveness for and be subject of some ritualistic sacrifice. So I asked them to give me an example, which I will transcribe in a fairy tale fashion. The first woman said, "My workmates are mostly men. Sometimes I feel like I cannot engage in the kind of conversations I would have with other girls. Therefore, Men were oppressing women, and I had to bow and atone for the sins of masculinity. The second woman said, let's say a girl has an interest in life sound engineering, goes to see a couple of gigs in town, and sees that most tags around are blokes. She will assume that's a job for men and will stop pursuing her dream. Therefore, men were oppressing women, and I had to bow and atone for the sins of masculinity. The man-hating dyke, who also happened to be paranoid, said, once I had to cover a sound engineering gig for a guy that happened to be sick. When I arrived, everyone was nervous. I did the gig, nothing special. Then they all came to thank me for the job and shake my hand like it was a big deal. So, I innocently asked, so that means they initially were nervous because they assumed that me, a woman, would do a bad job. However, I didn't, and they were really appreciative of that. Therefore, men were oppressing women, and I had to bow down and atone for the sins of masculinity. Fuck me. But I digress. The point is that it's one hell of a sweet spot. You lie to yourself about being oppressed and behave like an entitled brat, enunciate a couple of pseudo-intellectual sentences that the current narrative offers, and get showered with positive discrimination and all your entitlements. And the guy who did nothing to you and potentially leads a miserable life gets a short end of the stick, since for every positive discrimination, someone needs to be at the negative discrimination end of the spectrum. To these people, the BBC stands for the big brother who cares. To the rest of us, it stands for a big black cock shoved down our throat. J'accuse. Sacre bleu. So I think that this whole quest for equality based on blaming a demographic and zero-sum games is highly toxic and will promote infighting and bitterness, because no matter how you twist it, innocent people will get the short end of it, and entitled despots will piggyback on it. In a few weeks, I went from, lucky you migrants have it so easy, to, you're white and male, you have it so easy. Identity politics at its finest. I learned that identity politics, positive discrimination, and the blaming of perceived majorities not only come from confused people with otherwise good intentions. I also know now that many entitled psychopaths will ride this winning horse, even if it means trampling over others. Sometimes consciously, sometimes not. I accuse them both, but worry about the latter ones, since someone who lies to themselves is always looking for self-affirmation, and that could be such a dangerous thing. I also accuse the authors of the whole social narrative that offers a totalitarian view of the world where everything is expressed in oppressor and oppressed dichotomies, making misandry acceptable trend in passing. Time and again in history, we've seen how nothing good can come out of this binary thinking. I also accuse the progressives who think any sort of inequality should be solved by looking up and not down. Across the media, BBC's gender pay gap is portrayed as the grievances of women who earn hundreds of thousands against men who earn hundreds of thousands because they want to earn a few hundreds of thousands more. Meanwhile, the gaps between them and the lowest earners, or among the lowest earners, is nowhere to be discussed. One cannot shake the impression that the mantle of social justice has been donned by upper high-class brats trying to earn a few quid more while earning bonus virtual signaling credits. That the ones who have donned the mantle of feminism do little for women with real problems, and that the mantle of progressivism has been done by those who joined the conservatives in ignoring the reality of the lower working class. I accuse the political parties that deny class reality and instead focus on grievance politics, getting virtue signaling credits in the process. You realized it was easier to throw a few minority programs here and there as opposed to taxing the big fortunes, assuring rent remains affordable and helping the lower class. You clever you. This is the equivalent of kissing babies in front of the press photographers. I also accuse some of those who strongly advocate for diversity. You don't really want diversity past the purely superficial aspect. You want all sorts of diversity, except diversity of opinion. I also accuse British culture currently returning to a post-Victorian-esque era where nothing that might incommodate anyone can be said. Nothing can be challenging. Points of view have to be toned down or suppressed for the sake of political correctness, or else you risk being fired. 1,400 girls were sexually abused while the entire British establishment failed to call it out. But hey, political correctness is now central to Britain's identity in it, so who cares about its victims? Taking into account the fact that the BBC is the flagship of British culture, I find it hard to believe you actually welcome points of view that may challenge British values, like the ones migrants will naturally be more prone to having. And I don't think you are going to welcome this document either. Hopefully I'm wrong. That's all, folks. I'm sending this to 350 plus BBC email addresses, plus over 700 contacts I've made over my years in media, plus at around 300 media companies and professionals. Based on what I told you about me, and all these numerous recipients, should you all to witch hunt me or simply blacklist me, my real identity should be easy to triangulate. Yours truly, Patriarchor. One interesting difference between Spain and the UK is that in Spain, there's no fee for television. Franco had a great interest in making sure everyone could readily consume his propaganda. Since then, Spaniards have put up with propaganda coming from either side of the political spectrum. Thankfully, the UK is free from the weight of recent dictatorships and has a historical taste for the division of powers, so the telly's license fee is a voluntary fee. That means British citizens can opt out of it when they feel the BBC is not being just. That means British citizens can... That means...